Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first session of the Path to 100% Clean Energy Education Series. My name is Lillian Anderson, and I'm the Director of Energy Programs at Virginia Conservation Network. Virginia Conservation Network, if you're not familiar with us, we're the partnership of over 160 different environmental organizations who are doing work all across the Commonwealth to advance environmental protections at the state level. And we are so glad you could join us today. This is a three-part webinar series, and it's designed to give policymakers, candidates, advocates, and community members the tools and the knowledge that they need to understand Virginia's clean energy transition. So where we stand today, some of the key policy pillars driving progress, and the possible pathways ahead as we work together towards a 100% clean energy future. So today's session, Virginia's Clean Energy Pillars, will focus on two of the most important programs shaping Virginia's clean energy landscape, the Virginia Clean Economy Act and the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And we're fortunate to have two outstanding speakers with us to guide this conversation. First is Lena Lewis, an Energy and Climate Policy Manager at the Nature Conservancy in Virginia. And Lena's advocacy centers on lowering air pollution through energy efficiency, through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, aka RGGI, and clean transportation. And before joining us as a VCN member at the Nature Conservancy, she taught AP Environmental Science and Biology at Tandem Friends School in Charlottesville, so she brings a strong educational lens to her work. We also have with us Will Cleveland, the principal at Lighthouse Policy and Law. Will is an experienced energy and environmental lawyer who helps clients achieve a clean energy transition while keeping affordability and reliability front of mind. And before launching his firm, Will spent more than a decade at both private and nonprofit law firms, specializing in utility commission cases and lobbying on energy policy at the Virginia General Assembly. So we're going to begin today with two presentations from each of our speakers, followed by time for discussion and your questions. So as questions come up for you, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window to submit those. And we're going to be sending out this recorded webinar to everyone who registered afterwards. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. And I'm going to turn it over first to Lena to kick us off for a Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative 101.
All right. So, hi, everybody. So as Lillian said, I am Lena Lewis. I am the Energy and Climate Policy Manager for the Virginia chapter of the Nature Conservancy. So we all want to live in vibrant communities in which we all have affordable, clean, reliable energy, good health, clean air. And we all want to be able to enjoy the outdoors. I think we can all agree on this. There's no disagreement on that. The reality is that this future is out of reach if we increase our dependency on methane gas. The scientific evidence of climate change has not gone away regardless of growing energy demand. We have to have the resolve to stick with our zero carbon electricity goals, and we can achieve them if we decide we want to. Unfortunately, we already have the technology we need to have a zero carbon electricity sector, and advances are being made every month. When policymakers set the bar high, that drives innovation. And RGGI is a policy that gradually sets the bar higher, is technology neutral, and has proven to effectively lower carbon emissions for over 15 years, while generating proceeds to further fund energy efficiency, renewable energy, and other community benefits. The story of RGGI is remarkable. A group of bipartisan governors formed a multi-state collaborative program to lower carbon pollution from the power sector across their states, and they committed themselves to the outcome and spent years working out the details. They signed MOUs, developed a model rule, and then each state passed their own legislation and regulations based on that model rule. Every few years, RGGI does a program review to ensure that the program is working as well as it can and make improvements. So Virginia joined RGGI in 2021 through legislation passed in 2020. And as you have probably heard, Governor Youngkin pulled Virginia out of RGGI at the end of 2023. And as you've probably also heard, that exit was ruled illegal in Virginia courts, but Virginia is not back in RGGI because it is pending the appeals process. For the states that have been in RGGI since the start in 2009, they have lowered their power sector carbon emissions by 43%, which is faster than the United States as a whole. And this has happened as their state GDPs have continued to grow. So the gray line is the carbon emissions in RGGI states, and the blue line are those states' GDPs. And really great thing is RGGI has caused other air pollutants in RGGI states to decrease too, which has led to lower rates of asthma, fewer babies born with lower birth weights, lower rates of heart attacks, and fewer premature deaths in RGGI states. And RGGI was working for Virginia too. When Virginia was in RGGI, carbon emissions dropped 22% from the power sector. And when Virginia left, our emissions went right back up. So, I don't think we can say that this was happening exclusively because of RGGI, but it is a compelling set of data. And of course, there were other benefits that RGGI brought to Virginia. There was an average of $275 million in annual revenue that the state put towards flood resiliency for localities and energy efficiency for low-income households. So you may have heard the phrase cap and trade or cap and invest, which is how RGGI works, but you may not have had a chance to learn about how this functions. So we'll spend the next few minutes going over the mechanics of cap and trade, and then we'll get into the invest part for Virginia. But first, I just want to take a moment to remind us of why we are going through this effort to make this transition to clean energy. And I talked at the start about the bright future we want to build, but I also want to take a moment to think about the cost of not building that future. This photo is a representation of carbon dioxide from a methane gas power plant. And I say representation because carbon dioxide is invisible. And we enjoy the benefits from this setup. I mean, we all enjoy the benefits of the electricity that we get from this generation. And power plants enjoy a lot of profit from this setup. But there are costs that are paid by others from the climate change that this is causing. And these costs are already happening, and they're happening in Virginia. And we can quantify some of these costs. We can put a dollar amount on them, and it's a lot. These costs are real, they are painful, they are expensive, and they're going to keep getting worse for Virginians if we choose to let that happen. But if we choose to embrace a healthy future, RGGI is a policy that can help us get there. So this screen kind of summarizes how cap and trade works, and I put it here for later. But what I want to actually do is go through kind of a model oversimplified scenario of how cap and trade works. So this is a very oversimplified scenario of 7 power plants. And I say oversimplified because cap and trade really works best if you have a large market. So a multi-state market is what we really want. The more states, the better. You want to have, dozens and dozens of power plants involved in this system. So 7, not enough, but that's how many really fit on the screen. Okay, and so we know that there are many market forces at play affecting decisions about which power plants get built when. We know that we have expected demand growth in energy demand from data centers rather. We know that there are supply chain issues for methane power plants that already mean that methane gas plants have to wait for 5 years before getting built. We know that battery storage prices are dropping incredibly fast. We know that there are changes in federal policy, and there are many, many other factors influencing developers' decisions about what kind of generation to build. So I am not putting icons for all of those factors into this diagram because it would get way too crowded. I just mention them because I don't want you to think that I'm ignoring them. But under the current system on the screen and under the current system in Virginia, there is no price signal for carbon pollution. So we are essentially saying to the electricity sector, go ahead and pollute as much as you want. We don't care, because generators don't have to factor in the cost of pollution to their bottom line. But by joining RGGI, we issue a limited number of allowances that these generators have to buy for every ton of carbon pollution they emit. By putting a price on pollution, We can turn carbon into something businesses consider as part of their costs, and in some cases as part of their profit, rather than only a moral issue or a public relations issue. So this simple carbon market starts with a cap of 7 allowances, and the price of the allowances are set through an auction, but not like the auction that I would usually think of where the Van Gogh painting goes to the highest bidder. This auction ends up with a clearing price of $10, and all of the allowances go for the same price. So the power plants pay for their allowances, and notice, of course, that the carbon-free generators do not have to pay this cost. And also, as we go through my little clip art presentation, notice the change in size of the pollution clouds. Okay, so the power plants must retire 1 allowance for each ton of carbon dioxide. There we go. That they emit. But this power plant on the left did not retire one of their allowances because they figured something out. Maybe they figured out how to upgrade their power plant for less than $10, great deal. And so that was worth it to them. Or maybe they figured out how to offer energy efficiency to their customers, so they didn't need to use that allowance. So they can bank that allowance, or they can sell it. They can sell it to this power plant over here and make some profit. And this power plant that they're selling it to could be from a different state. These allowances are fungible between states. And so this secondary market is a really important part of the incentive of how cap and trade works, because it's giving these power plants a reason to think creatively about how they can lower their pollution. So this is year 1. Year 2, the cap goes down. We've taken away an allowance, and as the allowances are less plentiful, they become more valuable, and the price goes up. We're going to skip ahead a couple years to year 4, and the cap continues to go down, and we have fewer allowances. And I want to point out a couple things. Several of these power plants could be owned by the same investor-owned utility. Could be Dominion, maybe not. And as that utility is making decisions about their whole fleet, they should be evaluating the declining number of allowances along with the price of the remaining allowances. And they should be making business decisions about, what should they be investing in next based on, again, all these many factors we talked about before, but also based on the cap and the price of future allowances. And so I also want to point out just what we call the other plants that are independent. Those are merchant plants. So the investor-owned utility is thinking, solar is starting to make more sense. Energy efficiency for their customers is starting to make more sense. Merchant power plants, solar is starting to make more sense to these developers instead of more carbon-emitting plants. So for these merchant plants, 30% of carbon emissions covered under RGGI when Virginia was in RGGI, 30% of the carbon emissions were from merchant plants. And we're hearing about data centers that want to build their own generators on campus so that they can be independent from the grid and independent from utilities. Under RGGI, if those data centers build methane gas plants, those power plants would be covered under the RGGI cap as well. So continuing to look ahead, we're seeing more solar being built, maybe a bigger virtual power plant, the VPP. And finally, as that cap gets very low, we're seeing other kinds of carbon-free energy being built, expanded nuclear, expanded wind, more solar, and the retirement of some of these carbon-emitting plants, not because there was a deadline, but just because they didn't make economic sense anymore. So this is what we mean by saying that RGGI is technology neutral. It is allowing for anything that makes financial sense when considering the cost of carbon allowances. This is the graph of the declining cap for RGGI for the states that are currently participating in RGGI. So it does not include Virginia. And if Virginia rejoins RGGI, then this whole graph will get shifted upwards to include additional allowances for Virginia. The intention of RGGI is that this line will go to 0 allowances by 2050. That's kind of always been the idea that the design had in mind. But they haven't drawn that graph all the way out to 2050 yet, because they kind of wanted to see how things go. And RGGI goes through this program review every few years. And so they didn't need to map it all out ahead of time. So RGGI just went through a program review and updated RGGI from 2027 to 2037. And then you can see after that, from 2037 to 2040, the line just goes horizontal. And I don't expect that's the intention when we actually get to 2037 to 2040, that it's going to stay horizontal. That's just kind of a placeholder for now. When Virginia joined RGGI in 2020, at that point in time, for the latest program review, the graph only went out to 2030, and there was a horizontal line out from 2030. So I mentioned that because that meant that when the legislation was being written, part of the VCEA needed to accommodate the fact that RGGI at that point only went to 2030. So I'll show you, there's a little piece of, code trivia to impress your friends with. Hang on. So this is a piece of code that was part of the VCEA, and it says that the Air Board must adopt regulations for the period of 2031 to 2050 for carbon emissions from any electricity generating unit in the Commonwealth to reduce those emissions. And I just wanted to point that out. That's the reason for that, because RGGI didn't go that far then. But then it goes on to say the board may utilize its existing regulations. So if RGGI happens to be the existing regulation, the board can continue to use RGGI. A question I hear a lot about RGGI is, if Dominion passed its cost of RGGI allowance onto its customers, plural, did RGGI actually affect Dominion's decisions about generation? Did it make Dominion dispatch its carbon emitting generating units less? And I hear this question because Dominion did pass the cost of its allowances through to its customers. And that was about $3 a month for the average residential customer, about the cost of a cup of coffee at Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts. In comparison, the fuel cost for the average resident's electricity bill was over $24 per month last year, and Dominion is requesting to increase the fuel cost by almost $11 this year. And I think that's a relevant comparison because a lot of that fuel cost is, of course, from methane gas, and RGGI will help get us off of methane gas. So anyway, back to the question. Did Virginia joining RGGI affect the dispatch of Dominion's generating units? The answer is yes, it did. This is a response from an expert on behalf of Dominion to the SEC. He said, all else equal, adding the cost of carbon dioxide allowances to carbon emitting generating units that are subject to RGGI results in those units dispatching less. Okay, so maybe that's all the answer that you need, you're satisfied, but I'm just gonna go into what this means a little bit more. This has to do with our regional transmission operator. It's a multi-state operator, and you may have heard of it. It's called PJM. So if you have heard of PJM, it's probably because they've been making a little bit of a mess of things. PJM, well, they run a capacity market, and they run the capacity market to make sure that enough generators are being built now to make sure we have enough capacity for future energy demand. And that capacity market has run amok and become very expensive, and it's going to impact ratepayers. So set that aside, because that's not what I'm talking about right now. I want to talk about something else that PJM is running well, and that is the wholesale energy market to generate the electricity. Okay, so PJM only purchases the electricity needed to match demand at any given time. And the PJM operator, represented by this lovely woman on the screen here, the PJM operator dispatches the cheapest available electricity first, and then the next cheapest available energy, and so on. And as electricity demand goes up, the more expensive electricity gets put on the grid. Solar and wind already tend to get dispatched first because they have zero fuel costs, so they're cheap to dispatch. The price of each source of electricity is determined by each individual generator. They choose the lowest price they're willing to offer their electricity to the grid, and they consider all the costs of producing that electricity. You may see where this is going, including the cost of carbon allowances. So when fossil fuel generators have to add in the cost of RGGI allowances, that increases their prices at which they bid their electricity to PJM. And the higher their bid price, the less often that power gets used, and that creates more incentive to build lower carbon or zero carbon energy sources. Yeah. And so this graph represents that. Each dot on this graph is one generator. And the really expensive generators on the right only get turned on when energy demand is very high. And the black arrows on this graph show the effect of RGGI allowance prices, or any carbon cap and trade, on the carbon polluting generators. And you can see they're getting shifted to the right and getting dispatched less often. So that's what was happening for both Dominion and merchant power generators in Virginia when we participated in RGGI. So let's talk about the revenue that was generated. The funds that RGGI generates for states are a key part of its success in those states. As I said before, Virginia earned an average of $275 million per year over the 3 years that Virginia was in RGGI. And it split that money between ensuring an equitable transition to clean energy and protecting against the worsening impacts of climate change. And if that does not sound familiar, then I will restate it. Virginia split its RGGI revenue between energy efficiency for low-income households and loans and grants for localities for flood preparedness and resiliency. Energy efficiency is energy affordability. Each state decides how to invest their portion of allowance proceeds. Overall, RGGI states have invested 56% of their proceeds in energy efficiency. So Virginia is right on trend. Through the 2020 legislation in which Virginia joined RGGI, Virginia by statute also said we're going to invest 50% of the revenue in energy efficiency programs for low-income households administered by the Department of Housing and Community Development. This is an incredibly important need to fill for households that cannot afford the upfront cost of energy efficiency improvements that will permanently lower their energy bills. Improvements have been made on both existing and new homes through these RGGI funds, and they've been saving households an average of $676 per year on energy bills. This map shows the zip codes where RGGI funding has helped existing households improve their energy efficiency. The Weatherization Deferral Program helps existing houses make prerequisite repairs so that they can qualify for weatherization programs that would otherwise reject them. And you can see that this is helping people in zip codes across the state. It could be doing so much more. There are a lot of important conversations about how to make housing more affordable, but it is essential to remember that a home is not affordable if you cannot afford the utility bills. Making houses more energy efficient makes them more affordable to live in and to stay in. Had Virginia stayed in RGGI through 2030, we would have earned enough revenue to assist over 100,000 low-income households. Flooding is already the most common and costly natural disaster in Virginia, and it is expected to get worse because of climate change. So also by statute, 45% of the RGGI revenue goes to the Community Flood Preparedness Fund. Localities can use RGGI funds to make themselves less vulnerable to flood damage by diverting the water and using nature-based solutions to soak up the water. And at least 25% of the RGGI funds are intended for low-income communities. As this map shows, Communities across the state were receiving funding for this important work. Over 80 projects are underway, now restoring living shorelines, installing stormwater management systems in neighborhoods, and shoring up existing structures. Localities have used RGGI funds to perform flood analyses and to create plans to reduce flood risk. And now they need further RGGI funding to implement those plans. So in conclusion, RGGI accelerates the transition to carbon-free energy, it generates funds for community flood resiliency, and it fills in gaps in funding for low-income energy efficiency programs that no other funding is covering. So let's get back into RGGI.
Thank you so much, Lena. And I see a question coming in the Q&A box. So a reminder for everyone to keep using that feature, and we're going to get to all of the questions at the end of the webinar. So thank you, Lena. Now I'll hand it to Will to walk us through the basics of the Virginia Clean Economy Act.
Hey everyone, can you all see and hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, well, thank you, Lillian. Thank you, Lena. It's good to be here. My name is Will Cleveland. I'm an attorney in private practice working on clean energy. I'm not here on behalf of any particular client, just here in my personal capacity. So if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them, but please don't ask me any questions about any clients that I might have. Let's talk about the Virginia Clean Economy Act. And I want to start by one thing, which is to say that when we talk about energy regulation and energy policy in Virginia, the General Assembly sets the policy, but the State Corporation Commission, which is a creature of the Virginia Constitution, is tasked with actually overseeing and implementing how that policy plays out on the ground. So I also want to say that at the top, there is no achievable or sustainable clean energy policy that does not also equally prioritize cost and reliability. And so when I think about that, our goal, or the goals of Virginia, the goals of Virginia Clean Economy Act, are to create an energy regulatory landscape that equally prioritizes a transition to a zero carbon grid without compromising or sacrificing on reliability or affordability. And the way I know that is because the Virginia Clean Economy Act, or the VCEA, as it is often called, always from the very beginning accounted for and prioritized reliability. So this is enactment clause 9 from the legislation as it passed in 2025 years ago. And it says, and it has always said, that nothing in this act, i.e. the Clean Economy Act, shall require the utilities or the State Corporation Commission to take any action that in the State Corporation Commission's discretion and after consideration of all in-state and regional transmission entity resources threatens the reliability or security of electric service to utilities customers. That's been in there from the very beginning. And when we say regional transmission entity, what we're talking about there is PJM, which is what Lena was just talking about. They're the multi-state grid operator who actually control which power plants run and how they dispatch throughout the system. So the Clean Economy Act focuses on one of the three major utility services. Utilities like Dominion and Appalachian Power and our distribution cooperatives, they generally provide three different types of services. One is electricity generation. Two is transmission of that electricity. Think of that as the superhighways along which the electricity moves. And then three is distribution. These are more sort of the city streets that deliver the power to your homes directly. So Clean Economy Act focuses really only on the generation piece. And the goal is to, over time, by 2045 or 2050, depending on which utility we're talking about, to transition to a zero carbon generation fleet and a mixture of different types of resources to keep the lights on 24/7. When it was designed, the Virginia Clean Economy Act was built upon four key pillars. The first pillar is retirements. There is an existing legacy fleet of carbon emitting power plants currently operating within the borders of the Commonwealth of Virginia. The Clean Economy Act lays out a timeline by which those power plants, specifically the ones that emit carbon and that are owned by Appalachian Power and Dominion, must retire, because fundamentally you cannot have a zero carbon grid if you are still emitting carbon through electricity generation. Pillar 2 is energy efficiency. it has long been known, and is largely at this point uncontested, that the cheapest form of electricity is the electricity you never use in the first place. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. Pillar 3 is a massive expansion of the amount of rooftop solar that we can deploy to our grid. Because once we've retired the power plants that emit carbon, and once we have reduced the amount of electricity we need to consume as much as possible through energy efficiency, we want to maximize the built environment that we already have and put as much solar on the rooftops as possible. Because one, that takes off pressure of our farmlands and forests, and two, it locates electricity generation close to where it is actually consumed within cities and near homes. And then last and finally, once you've done all of those other three things, then and only then do you think about what types of utility scale solar, wind, storage, and other types of zero carbon resources do we need to build in order to make sure that we can keep the lights on. So pillar 1, how do the retirements actually work? Well, at this point, it has two different deadlines. The first was that by December 31st of 2024, Dominion and Appalachian Power had to retire all of their in-state operable coal and oil-fired power plants. There's an asterisk next to this because there are two in-state coal plants that are exempt from this 2024 deadline. One of them was the Wise County coal plant down in Wise County, also known as the Virginia City Hybrid Energy Center, or VCEA. And then the other is the Clover coal plant, which is a 50-50 ownership split between Dominion and the distribution cooperatives. The Wise County coal plant has an exemption because the Clean Economy Act recognizes that there are economic implications for a lot of what the law requires. And Wise County, as a county, gets a substantial amount of its annual tax revenue from the Wise County coal plant. And a very imminent retirement date would have seriously jeopardized the county's economics. And so one of the things the Clean Economy Act took into account was the real world impacts of the decisions that were being made. And it gave Wise County a far longer timeline in order to try to diversify its economy and build a more diverse tax base. The second mandatory deadline comes not for another 20 years, when all remaining carbon emitting power plants within the Commonwealth have to retire. And what I want you to take away from this is that as you hear people talking about energy policy is driving all of these retirements right now that are jeopardizing reliability, the Clean Economy Act is not to blame for any of that. There are no retirements happening between now and 2045 that are happening because the Virginia Clean Economy Act mandates it. Anything that retires in Virginia is going to retire based on the economics, not because of statutory mandates. Even then, the Virginia Clean Economy Act has always taken reliability into account. And so what Section 56585.5B3 says is that the State Corporation Commission can relieve the utilities from these mandatory retirement obligations if such a retirement will threaten the reliability or the security of the system. Now, the commission has to take all of PJM into account when it's thinking about doing that, and each potential retirement must be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. But if a particular retirement in 2045 is going to jeopardize the grid, the commission has the authority already to keep that power plant online so that we are never compromising or jeopardizing grid security and reliability. Pillar 2, energy efficiency. When I talk about energy efficiency, I am not talking about behavior modification. I'm not talking about shaming people into turning off the lights when they leave a room or things like that. What we are talking about is much more advanced technologies that we already use in our homes, in our businesses, that simply consume less electricity to do the same function. So it can be LED lights as opposed to incandescents, which actually last far longer and consume far less energy to keep the lights on. It could be heat pump water heaters as opposed to gas-fired water heaters. It could be heat pump HVAC systems as opposed to more traditional resistant strip heat. All of these things enable you to live exactly the same quality of life that you were living before without having to really modify your behavior, but simply use less electricity to do so. And time again, we see that investments in energy efficient appliances and technologies Although they require spending some money, that money is less costly to customers, to the utility, and to the system than building new power plants is. And so we always want to make sure that we are prioritizing energy conservation through energy efficiency and demand response programs and other demand side management opportunities to avoid building infrastructure where we can. The Clean Economy Act sets out mandatory savings targets that each of these utilities have to hit. Now you can see here on this chart that some of these numbers through 2025 are in green, and then the numbers beyond that are in purple. The green numbers were targets that were set out in the Clean Economy Act itself. The numbers in purple were targets that were established by the State Corporation Commission upon thorough review. And the way that happened was because in 2024, legislation was passed called the Savings Achieved via Efficiency Act, or the SAVE Act, and that directed the State Corporation Commission, as it was setting new energy efficiency mandatory targets for the utilities, to set the greatest level of savings that were feasible and cost effective. And one of the ways that we determine how an energy efficiency measure is cost effective is through a new test that the State Corporation Commission itself is going to author, that is going to say, in Virginia, what do we prioritize? What do we care about? How are we going to determine what is cost effective when we think about energy efficiency? The State Corporation Commission is going to write the test and then apply it to proposed programs. Pillar 3 is rooftop solar. There are limits in Virginia law as to how much rooftop solar can be installed in any utility's territory. Prior to the Clean Economy Act, it was one number. After the Clean Economy Act, it was a 600% increase in the amount of rooftop solar that can legally be installed in any one utility's territory. And that creates a significant market opportunity for rooftop solar installers to grow that industry, which is one of the most labor-intensive industries, which means it employs the most people, while still also being one of the most affordable from an energy generation perspective. So it creates new jobs, it puts boots on the roof, as we like to say, creates a lot of localized generation near load where it is needed most. And again, it takes pressure off of our farmlands and forests. And then last and finally is Pillar 4, and this is the Renewable Portfolio Standard, or the RPS as it is often called. And this sets out the timeline by which the utilities, specifically Dominion and Appalachian Power, have to transition to a 100% carbon-free fleet. There are actual targets set out for every single year between now and 2050 for the utilities. I have not put them all on this chart. I just wanted to show you sort of how it moves in every 5-year increments. So 2025, Dominion has to be 26% carbon-free. Appalachian Power is 14%. Because Dominion's targets are actually more aggressive, and they're going to be carbon-free by 2045, whereas APCO, because it is a more a smaller, less financially stable territory, has a longer lead time in order to make that transition. There are also mandatory resource proposals that the utilities have to do under the Clean Economy Act. So Dominion is required to propose to construct 16,000 megawatts of solar and 5,200 megawatts of wind and 2,700 megawatts of storage. But one of the things, and APCO likewise has much smaller targets because they have a smaller territory. But one of the things I want to prioritize here is that this is a mandate to propose certain things. One of the things that is frequently misrepresented about the Clean Economy Act is it is a mandate to build, and that the State Corporation Commission does not have the authority or the discretion to deny any of these proposals. And that is just fundamentally not true. So there is also, within the Clean Economy Act, a moratorium on new carbon emitting power plants. And the idea here is that we're trying to be carbon free by 2045 for Dominion or 2050 for Appalachian Power. If we build new carbon emitting power plants in the short run, as long as those mandatory retirement dates in 2045 still hold, that means that a new carbon emitting power plant that is built today will not be fully depreciated and paid off by the time it has to retire, which means it will not serve out its useful life. When a power plant retires early, before it has lived out its useful life, whatever the remaining balance is that has to be paid off, that gets passed on to customers. And so you're going to end up paying for a power plant that retires early and doesn't serve you for its full useful life, even though you pay 100% of the sticker price. That being said, if a utility can come into the commission and demonstrate that it has to build a new carbon emitting power plant in order to keep the lights on, and it demonstrates that it has already met its energy efficiency goals, and that there is no other viable alternative, the commission does have the discretion to allow construction of that unit. Again, the Clean Economy Act has always known that prioritizing reliability is an essential piece of making this a sustainable energy policy. And so we are entrusting and have entrusted the State Corporation Commission with the discretion and the authority to oversee that program and manage it accordingly. Now, I talked a little bit earlier about how the Clean Economy Act does not mandate construction of resources, and that is true. Declaring a particular type of resource to be in the public interest, which the Clean Economy Act very much does not mandate that the commission has to approve a particular resource, even if the type of resource is declared in the public interest. In fact, the State Corporation Commission itself has said exactly that. In 2019, it said, all parties in this case agree that the statutory requirement that the cost of a resource must be reasonable and prudent is neither nullified by nor subordinated to the statutory declaration elsewhere that projects are in the public interest. We agree with these conclusions. What this means is that even though solar generally might be declared to be in the public interest, if Dominion or Appalachian Power comes in with a proposal for a particular solar resource, the commission absolutely has the discretion to vet the proposed costs of that particular solar resource. And if it finds those costs are not reasonable and prudent, the commission can reject that application, even though solar is in the public interest. This is further entrenched right within the original text of the Virginia Clean Economy Act. It says in 56-585.5D4 that in determining whether to approve the utilities plan and any associated petition requests, the commission shall determine whether they are reasonable and prudent. We have always tried to make sure that the commission is the last word on anything that is proposed under the Clean Economy Act. The General Assembly did not mandate construction of anything. Certainly did not mandate ratepayers pay for the construction of anything. The commission makes that decision. There is no guarantee of approval of anything. When we talk about the Clean Economy Act, it's also important to talk about affordability. When a utility like Dominion or Appalachian Power builds a new power plant, it passes on the costs of that construction to its customers. It is not necessary to keep the lights on for a utility to actually own the power plants. There are plenty of other examples throughout Virginia where the utilities simply enter into a contract with a third-party owned power plant to buy the energy from that facility without the utility owning it outright. And in fact, the Clean Economy Act is trying to encourage private investment in power generation in Virginia by saying that 35% of the resources built under the Clean Economy Act have to be owned by third parties. We're trying to diversify the generation fleet and diversify ownership of it. When a power plant is owned by a third party and the utility enters into a contract to buy the power, the customers of that utility are insulated from poor performance at that facility. If it doesn't generate, then the utility doesn't pay, and therefore the customers don't pay. So there are definitely benefits to having a diversified ownership mix of power generation in Virginia. So as I had said, the trifecta of clean energy policy is zero carbon, reliable, and affordable. Virginia cannot afford to prioritize one of these at the expense of the others because no energy policy is sustainable in that regard. If the lights can't stay on, people won't support it. If people can't pay their bills, they won't support it. That's just a fundamental fact. One of the things that I think has also been frequently misunderstood, and this is the last thing I'll talk about before we start our Q&A under the Clean Economy Act, is what is the role of things like nuclear or geothermal, the things that are not expressly called out in the Clean Economy Act for resource proposals, the way that solar and wind and storage are. This is the year-over-year percentage that Dominion has to procure of clean energy under the Clean Economy Act's RPS every year up through 2045. I want to show you how this works in practice. These percentages are relative to the non-nuclear load. And here's how that works. In 2025, about 27% of all of the generation that Dominion had is going to be nuclear, which means that 73% of total generation is non-nuclear. The RPS percentages function as a percentage of that non-nuclear load. And so here's what that looks like in practice. In 2025, the RPS, as it is outlined under the Virginia Clean Economy Act, says that Dominion has to be 26% renewable. Well, it's 26% of the brown power. So that means that it's 19% of the total pie, because you're not going to be procuring clean energy to cover what is already carbon-free in nuclear. And that means that in total, you've got over 40% of generation that is carbon-free, because you've already got such a large resource mix that is carbon-free from the existing nuclear fleet. So in 2030, the size of the green pie increases relative to the size of the gray pie. And that is true in 2035, 2040, and in 2045, you're going to end up with a 100% carbon-free grid. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the Clean Economy Act does not mandate construction or proposals for construction of new nuclear resources, but it leaves open that possibility. And so to the extent that Dominion or Appalachian Power were to come in and grow the size of this purple pie, it would directly offset how much green energy you need to buy in solar, wind, and storage, because the total gray pie that I've talked about earlier would also be smaller. And so there is absolutely a place already within the Clean Economy Act for investments in advanced technologies that haven't yet quite come to market, like fusion or small modular reactors. But because those are not yet commercially viable, they weren't mandated for proposal in the Clean Economy Act. But as they become commercially available, the utilities absolutely already have the opportunity to bring them to bear. And there is an offsetting mechanism already baked into the Clean Economy Act to account for that. And so with that, I will answer any questions that you may have.
Awesome. Thank you, Will. And before we go to audience questions, I'd like to pose one for the both of you. Lena and Will, how do you two see these two policies working together, the VCEA and RGGI?
Well, I mean, I guess I can start. So as I said, the Virginia Clean Economy Act only applies to Dominion and Appalachian Power. And it is really a question of, and it's focused on, what is the resource mix that those utilities are going to be developing in order for us to hit our carbon-free goals. And other than the mandatory retirements, which again are 20 years off, there is no current or short-term ratchet on the carbon emissions associated with their fleet. And what I would posture is that RGGI is sort of the complement. It's the other side of the coin. VCEA is about what we're building. RGGI is about not only what are Dominion and Appalachian Power doing on a carbon emissions perspective, but the entire state's generation fleet. And I ask Lena to provide any additional context.
Yeah, I think that's you took mine, Will. No.
Sorry.
So yeah, I think that's really important that RGGI covers the whole state, not just Dominion Appalachian Power. And so just to reiterate a point that I made earlier that I want to stress again, that 30% of those carbon emissions under RGGI were coming from merchant power plants, so not Dominion or Appalachian Power. So those are not covered by the VCEA. And say again, as data centers are looking at how do they power themselves, if they are looking at a fossil fuel power plant, that would be covered under RGGI, not under the VCEA. So that's an important piece for how these two work together. And the fact that RGGI has a declining carbon cap matters because we are looking at increased energy demand. So Will just showed a pie chart. What we're looking at now is the pie is getting bigger in terms of total energy. So this is a little hard to picture, but it is possible that Dominion and APCO could meet their RPS, and yet their total carbon emissions could grow if their energy demand and their energy supply are growing fast enough. But RGGI will help deter that from happening because the carbon cap is there and it's absolute. It's not a percentage. I'm just looking over my notes. I think those are the main ways they work together.
All the questions we had. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. This is the first session of the Path to 100% Clean Energy Education Series. So a special thank you to our speakers today, Will Cleveland and Lena Lewis, for sharing your expertise and helping us better understand these really important programs and how they can work together to shape Virginia's clean energy future. We'll be sending out a recording of today's webinar to all the participants, so you'll have it as a resource to revisit, or you're welcome to share it with your colleagues. And we really hope that you'll join us for the upcoming sessions in this series. We'll continue exploring Virginia's transition to 100% clean. The next webinar is about meeting demand with clean. It's going to be on September 12th from 2 to 3:30. And the concluding webinar is an Energy Storage 101, and that will be on September 23rd from 1:30 to 3 o'clock. So thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you all next time.